Speaking of bagpipes, I've got a good joke for you. An octopus goes into a bar carrying a set of bagpipes. He sits down, the bartender pours him a drink, they get to talking a little bit. The bartender points to the bagpipe and says, "So, you gonna play that thing later?" "Play it," says the octopus. "As soon as I can figure out how to get the pajamas off it, I'm gonna fuck it." Or before we leave the topic of offal, what did the Zen master say to the hot dog salesman? Anybody? "Make me one with everything." Thank you. But as Redding pointed out, statistics and science are a fairly tricky, dodgy business, especially statistics, and we have to take them with a grain of salt. For instance, can we assume that because 4 out of 5 people say they suffer from diarrhea, that 1 out of 5 actually enjoys it? And what about language? I mean, language gives us a way to represent the world around us. But we often make the mistake of confusing the name of something with its actual identity, and we forget that it's really just a random system of sounds with no inherent meaning at all, a bit like music, for instance. For instance, why do we call something a chair? It's quite arbitrary. Why not call it a bingo ball? I'm sure that means something in some language. It's a bit like naming the chimps. It's totally arbitrary. But you know, it's interesting because we tend to imbue images with all kinds of powerful emotional meanings. And we forget that images as well are just kind of random associative objects that, based on juxtaposition and the associations we draw, repeated exposure over time. It's a bit like propaganda or advertising. It's just a learned system of interpretation. For instance, take the biohazard symbol. In this day and age with all these terrorists running around, if you're anything like me, you see this sign, it puts the fear of God into you. But there's no reason to be afraid of it itself. It's actually quite a nice symbol. It's just that we make certain associations with it. And if you compare it for a moment to the Olympics logo, you know, everybody loves the Olympics. It's a symbol of brotherhood and cooperation, all this kind of thing. But you know, when you look at them closely, the two symbols actually look very much alike. Because if you took the Olympics logo, made it black and white, and scrunched it up a bit, it looks just like the biohazard symbol. But no one's worried about the Olympics logo because we don't make the same kinds of associations with it. I'm not talking about the new Olympics logo. Have you folks seen that? That thing actually is terrifying. I don't know who designed that. But you know, that's the funny thing about symbols. Because the same symbol, like a swastika, can mean completely different things to different people. And the same thing is true in language of words. The same word can mean completely different things in different languages to different people. For instance, in Hebrew, all the pronouns sound very much like they do in English, but it's all kind of backwards. So for instance, the word for who in Hebrew is pronounced me, and the word for she in English is pronounced he in Hebrew. The word for he in English is pronounced who in Hebrew. So it's a bit confusing. Imagine, you know, that old Abbott and Costello routine about who's on first, what's on second. If you tried to translate that into Hebrew, it's a bit tricky, so try to follow this. The question is, who's on first? Well, if the word for who is me, then if who's on first, me's on first. And since I am me, then I guess I'm on first. But that can't be right, because I'm not on first, I'm just sitting around here. But if the who's on first is he, then he's on first. But then again, since he is he, and he really means she, then logically I suppose she's on first. If you ask me, that's what Garcia Marquez meant by the phrase hermeneutical delirium. And this even extends to the arena of sound. I mean, the same sound, not even a linguistic sound, can mean completely different things to different people. Like, think about the sound that a dog makes. In the US or the UK, we define, or rather describe that sound as roof roof or bow wow. Ask any kid, what sound does a dog make? That's what they'll tell you. But in China, they describe the same sound as wang wang. It's very interesting, you know, you'd think it'd be a completely objective thing, how a sound is perceived and described, but the Chinese people describe the sound totally differently than we do, which means they must perceive it completely differently. And before we leave the topic, what about frog language? In the US, we describe the sound a frog makes as ribbit, ribbit. But in Japan, they describe the same sound as kero kero. And in Korea, it's gaigun. So what sound does a frog make? It's actually quite a complicated question. It depends on who's hearing it. So think about it though, if there's all these languages in operation at the same time, each one's as good as the next, I mean, how do we know what the right name is for anything? I mean, maybe at the end of the day, English or Dutch is no more valid a way of communicating than French or gibberish, or those chimps that know sign language. Speaking of which, check out this. This is very cool.
Get him up there. Now you jump around us. Good kick. Up. Come on, kick it. One more. Right here. Come on, kick it hard. Kick it hard. Good kick. One more time. Good kick. Up.
I've been doing Tai Chi for years. This guy's really good. But this all leads to, once again, a philosophical question, which is, how do we know what anything is? Because as we've seen, when you take something, whether it's a word or an object or a sound or a sign, from its natural context and move it somewhere else, the meaning shifts entirely. So getting back to the Amazon for a minute, I mean, what would our friends in the Amazon make of a sculpture by Jeff Koons? For instance, this piece here. I mean, first of all, they don't have a system of conceptual or contemporary art like we do in the Amazon. They're used to objects having a more kind of use value, functional value. Second of all, they don't have inflatable animals in the Amazon. They wouldn't have stainless steel as a material. So what would they make of an object like this if it suddenly appeared in the middle of the jungle? They just have no frame of reference for understanding it. Well, what about this image? I mean, they don't have a system of conceptual art. They also don't have a figurative tradition in the Amazon of depicting people or things in imagery. So would this make any sense to them? I mean, certainly there are no clowns in the middle of the jungle. And, you know, it's interesting, when Western anthropologists showed photos to Indians in the Amazon for the first time, they didn't actually recognize them as, you know, referring to outside reality. They just thought they were kind of rectangular objects with marks on them. Well, that was a trick question a bit. That painting of the clown was made by John Wayne Gacy, who's that criminal I told you about in the beginning. And before we leave the topic, what about this image? You know, if they don't have a figurative tradition in the Amazon, they wouldn't have an abstract expressionist tradition either. So would this image make any sense in that context? Interesting question. Here's another trick question, because this painting was actually made by a chimp. And it sold a few years back for £10,000 at Sotheby's in London. Can you imagine? Here's your relativity of value right there. And you know what the chimp's name was? Congo. So if the same thing can appear to be completely different, depending on who's perceiving it, even at the same moment in time, you know, maybe it's simply impossible to say anything has a fixed identity at all. I mean, we might all be better off like those Buddhist people you read about who've attained the intuitive tolerance of the ultimate incomprehensibility of all things. Or as the deaf might say, but getting back to the Amazon, they don't record time or history the same way we do in the Amazon. They don't have an idea of private property or individualism. In fact, they don't even have a written language in the Amazon. They have no television, no advertising, no internet. They don't even have any pornography. I mean, can you imagine in this day and age a society without any porn? suppose it begs the question, why would you have porn in a society where everyone's running around naked anyway? But I think porn is more a function of alienation. It's not just about nakedness. A bit like contemporary art. Right?